You presented the paper about the new anticoagulant therapy, which is to be compared with the usual coumarin preparations. Well, the point is, this drug is, has the purpose to leave the patient off the control once a week or 2 weeks, because that would not be necessary. Well, the drug itself is a so-called thrombin blocker. And I read from your paper that already 45,000 patients have been treated with this drug. I think it's the same drug as what Mrs. Alves presented, rimonabant. The problem is with this new drug that there is no antidote when there is bleeding. A coumarin preparation, like mercumar and so on, can be stopped with fresh frozen plasma and with the 4 coagulation factors preparation. Heparin can be stopped immediately with protein chloride. But for this drug, there is only kidney dialysis. So I wonder if this drug can actually be put into trial as long as there is no antidote, because a bleeding event is always a possibility with anticoagulant therapy. I should like to have your comment on this problem.
I think the gentleman there was talking about dabigatran rather than
Maybe there is a bit of a misunderstanding. I'm not sure whether this group now wants to go into the finer details of pharmacology. No, this was about 3 different drugs where you want to compare the merits of A versus B versus C. And it has a common comparator, which was warfarin. That's the idea. Maybe I didn't bring it with sufficient clarity. But again, I'm not sure we want to go into this here.
I think possibly talking more general principles, perhaps we can have further conversation after the session about some of the issues.
In my opinion, this drug doesn't have to be brought into clinical trial because it's dangerous. That's another point.
I'm not sure if you want to comment on that.
No, I don't think we want to discuss individual drugs, the merits of this here. I mean, this has been evaluated by all regulators, major regulators on the planet. We know that there are risks. Warfarin is not the greatest of all drugs on the planet either. So they all came to a positive conclusion. I'm not in a position here to second guess this, if you please understand that.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I represent the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, of which HI is a part of, which represents millions of consumers and citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. First of all, I'd like to say, as a public interest representative, I'm rather perplexed that a representative of the European Commission or the European Commission agency would relativize the issue of conflict of interest with the idea that everyone has self-interest, whether it's academic, whether it's personal, or whether it's economic. I really don't think that the self-interest, the narrow interest, economic interest of a pharmaceutical company that someone is working for is the same as someone who is an independent academic or works for an NGO or works for HI in favor of public health. So I think this is not relativizing the idea of conflict of interest. I think is not in the favor of someone who works for an agency that is supposed to evaluate the independent evidence that is presented for a medicine. But that isn't the issue. I think the issue today is that I think the European Medicine Agency, the European Commission is under pressure and is opening up in certain scale of data. Nevertheless, on a legal situation, on a legal framework situation, there is a counter-reform that's going underway right now. The European Commission has presented a regulation for clinical trials that's being discussed now or presently in the European Parliament that is not at all an advance towards open access, but in many ways you could call it a deregulation. It has, for less dependable data, fewer safety requirements, and even less requirements. I'll just go over a few of the points that are coming up in this proposal, because this is what needs to be pressured from the people in this room. First of all, there are lower requirements for insurance and lower safety requirements for so-called low-risk or on-market drugs. The fact that it's proved you don't need to have so many safety requirements. Second of all, if you change a methodology or a protocol, once a clinical trial is underway, you do not have to inform of all of this change of protocol and methodology to the European Commission or to the EMA once it's underway. Only you have to inform if it's likely to have a substantial impact on the safety or rights of the subjects or on the reliability of the robustness of the data generated. What is substantial is not defined in the directive. And I think that's quite shocking. And also the idea that any drug that's already approved of does not need insurance, does not see safety, I can understand. Then there's no clarity on what database should be accessible. All it says is that the data should be available on a publicly accessible database. It doesn't mean that you're...
Can I ask you to ask a question?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'll ask a question. My general question is, do you think it's the only requirement in this proposal from the European Commission is that the pharmaceutical industry must present a summary of their data to an EU database? For an EU database, all you need to present is a summary. So there's no legal advance towards better data, towards raw data on that. Do you think that that's enough? Do you think that that's enough? And another point, it says it allows the people who perform the clinical trials to destroy the master files of clinical traded data after 5 years, which I think is absolutely shocking for the advancement of science and innovation. In many EU countries, the requirement is 15, 20, 25 years. Do you think that this is good for the advancement of science? That they could destroy all the information after 5 years? And then, finally, it also asks, it says that adverse events that have been mentioned here in this room do not have to be reported to the European Medical Agency. No, no, no. The language used in the directive that's proposed is only adverse effects. Now, effects can be caused by anything. An event is caused exactly by the drug that's being used. Anyways, I'm rather shocked that there's, well, at the same time in the European Parliament, there's a tremendous push for open data. No, I will finish right now.
Okay, thank you.
For open data in publicly financed research, for example, in Horizon 2020, and open access to scientific publications. And I think there are thousands of academics and scientists who are pushing for that. I'm kind of shocked that the European Commission would come out with a proposal that is, I think, is really a counter-reform and goes in the opposite direction. Thank you.
Okay, and who is that question to?
This is to the whole panel.
Okay, given we have two, Peter, I am sure you want to add to that, and given that we have two representatives of European agencies here, would you like to respond, Dr. Eichler, first?
I'm not the right person to respond to your concerns about the clinical trials regulation, because we are well known to be left out of this. If you look at that, we have no role there. I will not comment on that, and don't forget, we are only associated with the Commission. I'm not a representative of the Commission here. Please, let's be very clear about this. But I want to come back to you, though, because I think it is important. You made a point first on conflict of interest, and I stand by what I said. We take the commercial conflict of interest very serious. We now publish all, and we have a history in that, I admit that freely. If you want to know the conflict of interest of any of our experts, you should now be able to click on that. You see what they have declared. You see how we classify them. There's a rule and all that. We don't, no need to play this down. This is important. Does commercial conflict of interest have an impact on the views of an individual? Yes, it probably has. Undoubted. But then you said we should sort of not put that in the same category as personal conflict, non-financial. And I dispute that. I lived in academia for 20, 30 years. I know what it means, egos. I published it, I stand by it. I think ego trumps money. It is a very powerful motivator. We see this with our experts. If I have defended a position as a scientist for the past 15 years, is that a conflict of interest? In a way it is, yes, because I'm very unwilling to listen to another view. There are institutional conflicts of interest. I also think that our committees, and I don't know who said it before, I think it was you, if you have a group that has made a decision and then they are asked to revisit that decision, is there a reluctance to go back and say, well, maybe we were wrong? I think it is, absolutely. I call that also a conflict of interest. So there are so many things, and I think we should be aware of it, and we should not think just because a study of whatever nature was independent from a company, therefore it is somehow free of conflict of interest. I think we're fooling ourselves. Let me be very clear about that.
Yeah, but if 80% of the clinical trials are done by industry, obviously it's not the case.
Okay, the gentleman, it's okay, I'm the most conflicted person here. So sorry, that gentleman sitting in front of me wanted to speak.
I'm sorry, I
Sorry,
would actually like to comment on what David Hammerstein just said. I have seen some of these things that David commented upon, and that made me think, isn't there anybody who knows about clinical trials who is working now with the Clinical Trials Directive? I am appalled by these things that David brought up, and I will bring up another thing because I've lectured in medical ethics. I just heard here that the ethical assessment now can be separated from the scientific assessment. This is completely impossible, and I'll tell you why. For example, the Declaration of Helsinki says that before you start experimenting on people, you must have a thorough knowledge of the literature. If you don't have that, you can make unethical clinical trials. And we have many examples of exposing patients to harmful drugs. If people had done a systematic review before they started their trial, they would not have been allowed to do the trial because we already knew that the drug was harmful and killed people, and so on. And there is another thing about ethics that I will explain by an example. In 2009, the drug company Pfizer launched a big trial in the UK that was to be done in general practice. And what they wrote in the patient information was that the evidence whether celecoxib increases cardiovascular risk is inconclusive. So the idea was that they should be randomized to celecoxib, being told we don't know if it can be harmful to your heart. I'm sorry, I may be sued, but this can only be described as a lie, because we have known this, that celecoxib doubles the risk of myocardial infarction. We have known that for many years. I'm shocked by people thinking they can separate ethics from science. Pooh.
Well, that's what Peter thinks. Teresa.
I would, on the issue of the current proposal for the regulation on clinical trials, I think it's absolutely imperative that public health interest groups exert their advocacy efforts at Brussels level and throughout Europe to demand that there's a specific insertion, black on white, for access to clinical data. Because if we are not going to be the groups that are going to demand for that, it's not going to happen. And there needs to be very clear legislative framework to demand this access to data, because we certainly cannot keep with the present status quo. And some of the points that you alerted to are absolutely alarming. For instance, the definition of an adverse effect. And not only that, but the fact that only the serious ones will need to be reported by the sponsor to the EMA, for instance. And so who will decide what is a serious adverse effect? But also the delays into reporting the fatal or the very serious adverse effects are bigger than what we currently have. So in many aspects, this regulation is actually a lot of steps backwards from what was in 2001. So I find it absolutely alarming that that is happening.
Okay, the gentleman there was first, and then Jim, and then...
Okay, my name is Schipper. I'm from the International Society of Drug Bulletins. I think Dr. Eichler is right that he's not responsible for this guideline. Nevertheless, EMA should be alarmed by what was just said, especially also the possibility to destroy the data after 5 years. I think that's absolutely unacceptable. And That's not really a new problem, because there have been, in the speeches we heard before, also examples of data that has been destroyed. And I think as long as a drug is on the market, it's irresponsible to destroy any clinical relevant data on this drug, because some problems emerge so late, yeah? And I think that's really not a good idea. But coming back to access to medicines safety data, really, which is the main topic of this meeting, I think you had pro and cons on giving more access to data. I think misinterpretation of data can always happen. Yeah? Nobody is secure from doing that. But I think that can never be an argument to hide data, because that means that data, in most cases, will be misinterpreted, because a lot of part of the data is simply missing, and that inevitably will lead to wrong results. I think that's a very important thing to think about, and it's especially true for drugs already on the market. And I think that's the most critical point at the moment. What does happen to pharmacovigilance data?
Do you have a question?
Yes, and my question is how you will deal really with pharmacovigilance data. Will you wait till the Commission makes a decision? Many months may go before that happens, and that may mean that more patients will be harmed.
Okay.
Yeah.
I fully agree with you that the cons should not lead. Sorry, that is a benefit-risk decision, like any decision on a drug. And I think the benefits of transparency outweigh the risks, if I can use the language of my own world. So what we have to learn is to manage the risks. That's so far to that. I'm not sure I fully understood your question about the pharmacovigilance data before the Commission decision. Legally, a drug is not available, is not on the market before it is, sorry, it cannot be given before it is on the market. So in theory, you should have on the day, and there would be practical issues that it will be half a month later or whatever, but in theory, and that's the vision, on day 0, the drug is legally available, and then all the data should be out there that have been accumulated up to that point. Is that?
I think the question relates to the fact to data that is acquired on during post-marketing, and that might be being used by the regulatory agency to do a review, or will be discussed at the PRAC. When do you think that information will become available? Because, for instance, in the case that I presented, in the example of fingolimod, there was a review, because apparently there was a review procedure taking place. The agency did not provide the access to the information. However, there were patients using that medicine, and the access to that information is particularly important. We might be looking at actually preventing drug-induced harm at the same time that it's happening.
I do have to excuse myself, I don't know the fingolimod case so well. So you caught me on the wrong foot here. In principle, I would fully agree. Once a drug is out there, then the accumulated evidence should be made available as it comes. There is no issue with that. And in the pharmacovigilance legislation that came to us, I think it came into force earlier this year in mid-2012, it speaks exactly to that. So the vision is that everybody will have access to those data as they accumulate.
Okay.
Sorry, can I make it? To manage expectations, this is technically, again, a bit non-trivial. So there will be various phases how we phase that in. But again, the ultimate vision is you have access, you click on it, you see it.
There was...
Sorry, I was here.
Oh, you were here? Okay. Sorry, the lady at the back I didn't see.
Well, I'm sitting to the back. My name is Irene, and I have a question to Dr. Eichler about the EMEA position. If I understood right, the description you gave is that there's now a big change in the position towards openness of data, the clinical data. But my question is that does it also relate to the protocols, studies which are ongoing or being planned, or once they have finished, when the protocols, let's say 5 years from the beginning, what is your position towards those protocols? referring to the clinical trial registration, but more generally, in EMEA position?
Well, as I said, we will give out what we have. So I'm not exactly sure what your question aims at. There are protocols that are given to us as part of the dossier. And that is part of the clinical study report, as you have heard earlier from Tom. That should be given out, fine. I mean, there are people who say we should make the clinical study report clickable in the EPOL. And in principle, there's nothing wrong with that, fine. It's a technical difficulty. Yeah, well, IT is not as easy as it seems, but I have no problem with that. There's nobody here. When you say ongoing protocols, well, we don't have that. If someone in Europe or anywhere on the planet decides to run a protocol, we cannot give that to you because we don't have that. Once the company submits to us, let's say in the course of a variation, so they want a new indication or whatever, then I think the same rules should apply as for the initial application. Does that answer the question?
So, well, I think my question was wrong, because I think that I misunderstood. So your statement about the openness concerns only what EMEA has. It doesn't take a stand in general that what data should be available to outside the owners.
Look, I'll give you two answers. One is the legalistic one, and I'm under the watchful eye of the Ombudsman here, is we can only give you what we have. End of story. We're not responsible for the whole world. Are we aware that if this goes through as we foresee it now, and as we discussed it today, that this will change the standard for everybody else? And academia will come under the same pressure, and our colleagues in the US and elsewhere also. Well, I would assume the answer is yes, but that is an assumption.
I'd like to, sorry, I'd like to quickly follow up on Dr. Eichler's point there. What do you think, if you say you're not responsible for all the data and you can only give out what companies give you, I mean, what sanctions do EMA take? So, for example, if data is withheld, adverse reaction data upon submission to EMA for licensing, what sanctions do EMA take, or what sanctions should Europe take?
Again, in the new we didn't have the possibility of sanctions in the past. With the new pharmacovigilance legislation that came into force earlier this year, there is now the possibility of sanctions. So, for example, if we agree with a company on a post-licensing risk management plan, and they don't do that for whatever reason, then there is the possibility of invoking sanctions. This is brand new, so before you ask me what is the experience, I can tell you we don't have any yet.
Do you want to, Tamás, do you want to make a point that's relevant to this? Or yeah, Tamás, quickly make a point relevant to this and I'll come to you then, Tom. Okay?
No, but go ahead.
Just very briefly, we do, at the ATG, we do protocol reviews. It is possible. So they just give these protocols to us, but you know how we achieved this? We started with the informed consent forms. So we told these guys that we want to see the informed consent forms because maybe we can say something relevant. And from this it grew up to the point where, according to a recent in-house survey, 75% of the companies that we work with do give their protocols, trial protocols to us before implementation, so that we can review those and you know, say what we think about it. But start with the informed consent forms, because there you might be able to say something relevant, and then you can work your way in there into this process gradually. And to the question, why would they want that? Well, it's easy for us because we can tell it to HIV patients not to apply into trials if we think that those trials are not right. So there is the trial and there's no patient. It's pretty simple then.
Okay, Tom.
Yeah, you are setting a precedent, and the FDA, the TGA, the PMDA will find it untenable. And as you can see, I've torn my hair out. I'm crying because all these poor other regulators are going to have to cough up what they've got. Terrible, terrible times. But the issue is slightly larger. We can only get what you've got. But did I catch something in your presentation, Fergal? Am I correct when you said that you can actually request, if you have a complaint, you can actually request EMA to request the missing data, any missing completed trials on a drug upon which a decision has been made. which EMA do not hold, but they can go to the original manufacturer and ask. Is that right?
I was talking about a hypothetical situation that hasn't happened, but clearly,
Let's
in relation to any regulatory agency, it is a question of good administration, whether they exercise their powers correctly and fully. So, of course, if the possibility does exist to sanction a pharmaceutical company, or to, first of all, question them, and then if you find that they haven't provided sufficient information, well, if those powers do exist, then the question hypothetically arises whether they're being exercised correctly.
I can see the
We have not received such a complaint, but I would imagine in relation to any institution or agency with regulatory powers, that's a question that could arise. Because if you don't have it because you haven't exercised your powers correctly, it's a separate problem from access to documents. Of course, it's related to it, but it hasn't risen yet, but I can imagine it would be a possible issue.
Thanks, both.
I'm sensing a bumpy road ahead. Peter.
Yeah, I can do it quickly. You will get a request from us pretty soon if the EMA doesn't do the work, because we have discovered that a good deal of EMA does its best, and I'm extremely grateful for that. But we have discovered that some appendices and some pages are missing in the clinical study reports that we are going through right now. So we will first ask the EMA for these missing things, and if we get the response that they don't have them and they will not pursue them by the company, then we'll complain to the Ombudsman. But I hope this will not be necessary, because we now collaborate so nicely with the EMA, so I really hope this will continue. Hans-Georg.
Peter, EMA are not allowed to ask on behalf of third parties. That's the answer. That's the answer we got.
But if documents are missing that are supposed to be in EMA's possession,
who says that they're supposed to be in EMA's possession?
Dr. Eichler, would you like to? Life would be so much duller without Tom and Peter. Dr. Eichler, would you like to respond?
So first of all, I'm hearing that we'll all have a job in the next year. That's the good news. No. Okay. There is a lot of what does EMA have and what we do not have. In theory, the legal situation is a company has to give us everything they have. So they cannot choose and say, we'll give you this data, but this is not so good, we'll withhold it. No, that's out. The legal situation is not the issue. The issue was our own capability and capacity. And the FDA will tell you gleefully, EMA doesn't have all the data because they can't analyze it. And they are factually correct. We didn't have in the past. We're a relatively young institution. We work in a network across Europe. If you ask me, do we hold the data electronically in such a format that we can do what the FDA does, the honest answer is no. Simply because we couldn't do it. We could, if a company gave it to us, a CD-ROM or 100 CD-ROMs, we'd say thank you very much and put it somewhere in Hampshire. There's that archive. Not very helpful. So we recognize that this has to change, and what we will in future, and this will be part of this whole policy change, we will basically tell the industry, you give us the whole raw data set electronically in a useful format. That means that we will have to develop the capability and capacity to analyze, and also when we have it, we will have to give it out. So again, we're looking to the future, and we like to believe that this case that Peter just addressed will hopefully not occur as of date X.
Can I just say that you're familiar with Mr. Elliot Spitzer and his successful prosecution of GlaxoSmithKline on paroxetine, if I remember right. The appendices of paroxetine trials were part of the settlement, but they've only just appeared on the GlaxoSmithKline, especially the 329 appendices, appendices related to 329. They've only just appeared on that. So that is a part of a legal settlement. Part of that settlement is that there's closure of all the trials related to that drug, and yet it was only through the dogged perseverance of one person 8 years later that those appendices, full appendices, this is important, because the appendices, Roche calls them modules, the rest of the world are under using a guideline called an Appendages, they contain the important stuff, the really important stuff, the protocol certificate of analysis, the RAP. They contain in certain cases they contain IPD, unfortunately paper format, and so on. Only 8 years afterwards, and only through pressure that happens. Now, is that misconduct? Is that something which in this case, if you get sent a trial which is supposed to have a CSR, which is supposed to have 5 modules, and EMA you only get 2, is that something that the Ombudsman could get involved in? That's no more hypothetical. This is real stuff. Is it your?
Maybe we'll carry that conversation outside because there's quite a few questions still here. I think Dr. Eichler's got one for you guys, and then we've got 2 more questions over here. So I don't know how much time we've got left.
Sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt. I think Dr. Eichler has to leave now.
Okay.
So we can continue with
questions.
I'm being taken care of very well. Thank you for that.
No, it's explaining.
But I have a question for this whole group here. Okay. You talk about clinical trial data. Why I'm surprised that the one question has not come up that I would be interested in. Who owns clinical trial data? And I'm looking across the panel to the patient representative. If I was a patient in a clinical trial, I would have an answer for that. Why does that not come up? Because that might clarify a lot. We don't own clinical trials, we hold them because we're given that and someone else comes, fine. Why don't you go to that discussion that might be very helpful? Who owns?
Does anyone have a comment?
I have one.
Okay, lady there, then you, Peter.
I think that is actually a question. This is Hoon, lifelong member of Health Action International, and like many of us, a patient at times. And this is actually a question, I remember discussing this at high meetings many years ago, where we took the position it is the people that contribute to those trials that own the data. Those trials could never happen otherwise, and they actually have a very strong right, or should have a very strong right to the data. The strange thing is that is not how that information is being dealt with. The companies very much act as if they own, as if it is their property right, and they are often protected by a wide range of agencies that bend over backwards to keep it like that. But in fact, and this is also where we, I think, as consumer activists have a little bit of the blame to take. I don't think we have been clear enough, and we have not made clear enough demands on our politicians to translate that notion that we actually own that data through participating in those trials, that translate into action and into very clear directives to agencies such as medicines agencies, etc.
So apparently there is a legal answer to this.
If we have a legal framework which establishes a right of public access to the documents, and we understand that ownership is your capacity to deny somebody the right to use something. You own your house, you can decide it comes in, goes, and doesn't come into your house or your car or whatever. If we take that into account, we have to say that the public as a whole owns these documents. We have a right of public access. It's not the patients, it's not the pharmaceutical companies, it's not EMA, it's the public as a whole, it's all of us. If we want to give effect to the right of public access to these documents.
Okay, and there's so many questions. Can we really literally keep it to questions? Jim, then Andrew, then the guy here. There's three final questions. I'm conscious of time.
I'm actually slightly breaking, yes you can hear me, the rule because I want to offer some hope. That proposal on clinical trials can be changed. I've spent 18 years as head of the European Consumers Organisation. My whole life was changing decisions in Europe. This can be changed, but it needs 2 things. It needs the expertise there is here to say what should be in it. It also needs a degree of expertise to translate that into EU speak, if I can put it that way, so that it can go through. There are some things in favour. There's an English Labour MEP, Glenys Wilmot, who is the rapporteur for the proposal. She will carry it through. So if we can get things together, that can potentially give access to clinical trials before they ever go to the agency. And even for clinical trials that never go near any regulator other than the one who approves it in the first place. Can be done, it has been done before.
Oh, I think Andrew probably had a question, did you?
I had a question for...
Go and buttonhole him, run!
Well, the question you can all ask him separately and he'll be really bored. Does this transparency extend to risk management plans agreed between the EMA and manufacturers? Because those ought to be open to discussion and updating as the marketing and use of a drug continues. I think that it's absurd for this to be a private agreement between the EMA and the company.
Perhaps you can provide an answer to that? Is there any kind of legal...
I think it's, I wouldn't venture an answer without looking at the specifics of what actually is contained in these documents. So I'd rather...
Should we put a request forward to you?
The procedure is you make a request to the agency first. If the agency refuses, then you can complain to the Ombudsman.
I think you might have a few things coming in your queue. Hate to be the bearer of bad news. Sorry, the gentleman there who has been so patient.
Wonderful. Yeah, so my question is to Tamás Bereczky. So just to change a bit the perspective away from the EMA, because I found it quite striking that you made your point very clearly that you see yourself as this patient expert activist. How did you already, or did it come into your discussions with pharmaceutical companies, these issues of the ethical dimensions of the clinical trials that SOMO presented so strikingly? Is this something that came already up in your lobbying, or do you think this might be something you would also like see yourself as also representing patients in such trials outside Europe who are obviously much more vulnerable to the negative sides of these kind of contracting out tendencies?
Yes. We have regular ethics trainings for our members and also for non-members. If they want to come, then they are welcome. We are also involved actually in the development of the new clinical trials directive. We submitted a number of proposals, none of them were accepted, but we did propose. We keep an eye on trials going on elsewhere, not just in Europe as far as possible, and we try to intervene. But of course there's a limit to that. I mean, even if in comparison to cardiovascular or cancer or whatever, HIV is relatively small with the 84 million patients, but it's still a big disease area. And this is called the European AIDS Treatment Group, hence our primary objective is to deal with Europe. But, I mean, unethical trials also happen in Europe. I mean, there's no question about that. And yes, we monitor that, and yes, this is something that we really try to consciously follow up on as much as possible. And we have a network of activists to rely on. So I can only encourage patients to establish patient organizations, and then patient organizations to become active. That's the way to go.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap. As ever, I am running hideously late, but I think Katrina wants to have a few words at the end.
Just a few closing words. Hi, my name is Katrina Fergal. I work for Health Action International, actually the European office. And as you've heard also from Ellen's intervention, access to medicine safety and efficacy data is very important for HI as an organization. We see our role in this debate as promoting policy change through advocacy at the European level. And I invite you to follow our work, to make your voice heard on the clinical trials regulation proposal, and to join the broader movement towards greater access to data. So on that note, I'd like to draw this meeting to a close. I would